To read the second reading from the Gospel of Matthew, the 14th chapter, verses 13 through 21. Listen for the word of the Lord. Now Jesus, when he heard the news of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed, and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have 2 children, a son, Robert, and a daughter, Audrey. And my son was determined to spend his summer, this summer, out in Colorado. And if the altitude north of Fort Collins at a forestry campus of the Colorado State University wasn't enough for him to take on, he has found a group of friends who are hell-bent on climbing those mountains. We're talking the Rocky Mountains, near Rocky Mountain National Park. Actually, they're doing more than climbing. They're trail running, actually. And about a week back, their motto was 7 mountain peaks, 30 miles, 3 days. Well, the interesting thing is, lo and behold, receptivity is better on the top of a high mountain. The interesting thing is that using technology, I can actually communicate better with my son when he's on a mountain peak. In fact, I actually can even Skype with my son from a mountain peak, which is something I cannot do when he's not on a mountain peak out by Fort Collins. I'm quite lucky my son and daughter will communicate with me by text. But anyway, I just want to let you know that one of the questions, when I got this communication from my son, who was high on a mountain peak, one of the questions I had for him was, "Do you feel closer to God?" Of course, it's an "and" kind of question. It's a God question, as my daughter would say. You see, we know about these places. We know our scriptures and the times in Scripture when we're told that people go up to a mountain. Moses went up to a mountain, and he came back down with the 2 tablets. We know that Jesus, in the later story in Matthew, takes some disciples up on a mountain, and the disciples see Jesus turn radiant, his face and his clothes turn white, and he's standing there. He's standing with Moses and Elijah. And so we know these wonderful things, these transcendent kind of things, these God kind of things happen high on a mountain. It's that thin place where we kind of touch into the heavens and we think that God is especially present there. So my son texted back, to my question, do you feel closer to God? My son texted back after a few minutes, and it said this: well, it is harder to breathe up here. So I had to laugh, right? This is my son's sense of deadpan humor. This is a Rob thing. And so I laughed. But what happened is that my son, without even knowing it, he literally grounded me deeply in Matthew's telling of the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Because I was wrestling with this story at that time. You see, this story in Matthew about this feeding of the 5,000, it is a story about feeding a large crowd with seemingly little food. So it is a miracle story, and it signifies that Jesus is extraordinary. But this story is more so a story about Jesus' response of compassion. Compassion poured out when he faced human need. Well, let's step back a minute to think more in our imaginations about this story. It would not be a stretch to imagine that Jesus and his disciples, they were weary. After all, they had received the unwelcome news about the tragic death of John the Baptist, a gruesome story, a story of a beheading carried out by the Emperor Herod. And so we can imagine that Jesus, the disciples, and the people, they were filled with grief, and they were probably fearful for their own lives. The text tells us that Jesus, he tried to withdraw from the crowds to a deserted place, but the crowds found him. And then, in a change of momentum in this story, Jesus goes among the crowds, and he pours himself out in the crowd, and he cures the sick. This portrayal of Jesus in this story in Matthew, this is all about Jesus' concern for our human physicality, for our physical being, our physical health and well-being. When Jesus feeds the people the bread and the fish, it is their ordinary fare. They're quite used to eating that. What makes the meal extraordinary, says biblical commentator Douglas Hare, is that it is the host, Jesus, that makes this extraordinary. And we're to hear in this story echoes of the people's other stories about God. This God who supplied manna in the desert, told in the Exodus story, and the story about Elisha, told in 2 Kings, about the time when he fed 100 men with 20 loaves of barley bread, and there were leftovers. And by the way, one biblical commentator tells us not to get too jazzed up with the idea of extraordinary abundance, because the way he sees it, the leftovers in this story are just about the leftovers you would have if you had a large family reunion and you were left over with one package of hot dogs. In other words, we should be thinking sufficient and satisfying, and not necessarily abundance. But this is also a teaching story. You see, the disciples are skeptical, and through their eyes, the circumstance is bleak, a deserted place at a late hour. And the disciples are saying, oh no, I'm not taking on this problem. No way. at a deserted place at this hour, and you want more from us? Well, many of you can relate to such an experience, I'm sure. It's that feeling that you have nothing left to give. It's the waitress at a restaurant, her feet aching and her patience worn thin. She's worked a triple shift, and lo and behold, a customer walks into the restaurant and wants to be served a meal. Perhaps also it's the cook who's tired and has cooked all day, and he's asked to serve yet one more meal before he can go home and rest. Or when you, as a parent of a new baby, and your baby wakes up at night for the third time, and now it's the wee hours of the morning, and you're just so tired, and your baby wanting to be fed again. Or perhaps you work in the healing professions yourself. You're maybe a therapist, and you've done very good work with a client, but then the call comes that your client is in crisis yet again, and could you come now? Could you come now? And you were just about to leave for a few days of rest with your family. So now we're in the story, aren't we? You're in the story, and you're in the story, and you're in the story. We're now the disciples, and Jesus says to us, you give them something to eat. So here's the twist. It's not so much a story about being fed now, is it? It's become a story about us feeding others. Our task, like it was for the disciples that day in the desert place at a late hour, our task is to grasp, that is, to know and understand and trust Jesus' compassion in order to be able to show others the kingdom breaking in their midst. Disciples called by God to meet the needs of others. Jesus' disciples. The needs of others: food, water, shelter, safety. And this is about participating in gathering God's new community in Jesus. You may be aware that I've been spending time visiting and getting to know many of you. I'm directing my energies first to persons whose needs Pastor Andrew and I determine are the most pressing. I'm visiting people in times of illness or those who are hospitalized. I'm visiting people in care facilities. I have had wonderful visits. I've met remarkable people. They have shared their stories with me, stories of their discipleship. We have shared prayer together. And I have gone out from these visits encouraged and inspired, and my imagination stirred about how this kingdom will next break in. The other thing that I've noticed is that not only have people shared experiences of prayer, but that they are also sharing their experiences of discipleship and building community. After you leave this place, many of you continue to build community. One man looks to connect with those he terms persons who are light, like a flashlight, he says, noting that those persons help him to be positive and to have hope. And so there's a mutual discipleship that brings in the kingdom. Another woman says that while she doesn't understand why God took her spouse At a young age, she has accepted it. She has faith. And now, as the matriarch, she has encouraged in her discipleship 2 generations now connecting with the life of the church in this community. Another man talks of a sense of mutual feeding one to another that he had with a church member he visited regularly and prayed with in that person's last season of life. So life in any church community, well, at times its members, they become disgruntled with the way things are. Sometimes they find a common clamor and they say, I am not being fed. Meaning, perhaps the sermon didn't suit me, or the hymns are not the ones I like, or change is too hard. I prefer the church to remain the way it is, or to go back to the way it was before. In the life of a church, a person in the community may keenly feel themselves, at one time or another, to be in a deserted place, alone, and the hour is late. Every human life has moments like that, or stretches of time like that. It's what contemplatives call a dark night of the soul, and what others might call a crisis of faith. But it's often these painful experiences, as unpleasant as they are, they render us distressed, but it's often these experiences wherein we deepen in our spiritual selves. As disciples of Jesus, somehow, some way, we hear, we recall Jesus' command, feed the people. And out of the fog of a dark night of the soul, we participate in God's work. I want to share a story. This is a favorite story of mine. I call it the I'm no good for anybody story. I met a fellow, he was in his 90s, and quite frankly, he was bitter. Now, we can understand his bitterness because he was affected by declining health. And the effects of that were in his mind and his spirit, not just in his body. And he said, I am no good to anybody. His bitterness was expressed in that he felt nobody could understand his suffering. You see, he had a disease which gradually reduced his ability to see. He was just about blind. And the doctors had not been able to cure it. In my conversation with him, his bitterness turned into lament and anger, and he said, nobody understands what I am going through. Nobody understands. After a pause, I said, I can't imagine your suffering. But would it be possible that Jesus understands? And the man became very still. And as he nodded his head, yes, he began to weep. And in his weeping, he said, that made me feel so good. That made me feel so good. And then he continued, I was a church goer for many years. I went to church every Sunday, but I also worked for the church however I could to help out. And I helped people because I loved Jesus. I remember helping lots of people. And then he went on to explain and tell me stories, at least 3 of them, about how he had helped strangers who were in bad circumstances. Now, as he spoke and recalled these times when he had been helping, his face, well, it lit up with joy. I guess that in the 9th decade of life, perhaps discipleship looks a little different. Perhaps it's about stirring people's imaginations with your stories about what you accomplished in earlier decades, and stirring the imaginations as to what can be accomplished moving into the future. You see, in recalling these pieces of his own self-history, this man regained his story in God's story, his sense of purpose in God's purpose. And while he had lost touch with his church and his church had lost touch with him, well, Jesus never lost touch and he never lost touch with Jesus. You see, when he recalled his discipleship and he embraced his stories, well, he was fed in his own soul. And in his telling his story to me, I was drawn deeply into community with him. And we both were drawn into the larger community of all believers in Jesus. You see, God has moved a great distance, and we no longer need to meet God only at the top of a mountaintop. Now, Jesus is God with us through all human experience, all human want, injury, sickness, struggle, frailty, aging, loss, dying. And oh, my son, remember I told you about him when I first started speaking with you? Well, the one who's been climbing mountain peaks. Well, as you know, he's the oldest of my children. Audrey is my daughter. Well, once when they were little and we had gone to a new church, we were in communion. And as my children passed the communion tray of the tiny glasses filled with juice, well, it spilled. It spilled all over. And there was a gasp, a moment of confusion. You see, we really wanted to be accepted. We were new. We wanted to belong. And so there was some remorse, a little bit of shame, a lot of regret. We held our breath, but no condemnation, only assurance, compassion, love, grace abounding everywhere. And suddenly everyone was pitching in, rolling up their sleeves, gathering paper towels, and sopping up the blotches of purple juice that had spilled out all over us, my son and my daughter, down their clothes, soaking their clothes, spilled on the chairs, even the floor. The presence of Jesus in all our messiness in this human life. Praise be to God.